Welcome to the public webinar series at Tokyo College, Institute for Advanced Study at the University of Tokyo. My name is Naoko SHIMAZU, and I'm professor at Tokyo College and a global historian and the moderator for today's webinar. So now allow me to introduce today's panelists. Our speaker is Professor Andrew Gordon, who is a friend of Tokyo College, having visited us previously as a Tokyo College professor. And this time he is back as an Ushioda Fellow. So welcome back.
Thank you.
Professor Gordon. And Professor Gordon is the Lee and Juliet Folger Fund Professor of History at Harvard University. He's a historian of modern Japan and has published extensively on the history of labor and of gender and consumers. Recently, he has written on the social and political history of Japan's lost decades of the 1990s and 2000s. He is currently working on a book tentatively titled Modern Memories, the Public History of Industrial Heritage in Japan. Now to comment, we have Professor IOKIBE Kaoru, who is at the Graduate School of Law and Politics at the University of Tokyo. He has written extensively in the political and diplomatic history of modern Japan, specializing in the unequal treaty revision issue, as well as the history of party politics, local governance, and nationalism, to name but a very few. It's a great privilege to have you with us today, Professor IOKIBE, and we are very grateful to you for making time in your very busy schedule. So before we start, I'd like to draw your attention to the availability of simultaneous translation. Please click the translation button at the bottom of the screen, which looks like a globe, in order to switch to Japanese or English. Today's session is conducted in English. For the Q&A session, please post your questions in English or Japanese in the chat box on the screen. So today, Professor Gordon will speak on Rethinking the Japanese Past, revising a textbook, revising history, delving into the process of revisiting and revising for the 5th edition of his ever-popular introductory book entitled A Modern History of Japan, From Tokugawa Times to the Present, published originally in 2002 from the Oxford University Press. Without further ado, the floor is yours, Andy.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the kind introduction. And let me pull up my slides and get started. All right. So as Professor SHIMAZU mentioned, I'm working on a different topic at the moment that I've spoken about to people at Tokyo College on a few occasions. So I thought I'd do something a little different this time and talk about the topic, as you see, stepping back to talk, to offer some thoughts on the writing and the rewriting of history. I want to first thank my two friends and colleagues who are with me today, Professor SHIMAZU Naoko at Tokyo College as the host and moderator, and Professor IOKIBE Kaoru as the commentator. And I've known both for many years, and I'm really grateful for you to be here. And also I'm grateful to the staff at Tokyo College for supporting me in my various visits and for helping to facilitate this talk today. So let me jump in. There are two well-worn axioms about history that many of you are probably familiar with. And at first glance, they cut uneasily against each other. The first, which is here on the screen, the past is a foreign country. It seems the original writer of this statement, at least in the English language, is was a professor of literature at Oxford in 1949, David Cecil. And you can see the way he put it, past periods are like foreign countries, regions inhabited by men of like passions to our own, but with different customs and codes of behavior. More pithily, a writer of fiction, I think, drawing from David Cecil, put it in a novel. I won't bore you with the complicated plot of this novel, which I haven't read, but I've read a summary of it. The past is a foreign country, They do things differently there. So that's one view, which I think has merit, the idea that we should approach history with a sense of the pastness of the past. It's not the same. It's a different world. A second well-known statement, I think even better known, at least among historians, most people who do graduate work in history and many undergraduates ever since the 1960s have been asked to read this book, What is History, by the important British historian E.H. Carr. History is an unending dialogue between the past and present. At first glance, these two views seem to conflict with each other. The upper view that the past is a foreign country suggests a disconnect between the past and the present. The Carr's view suggests a connection. But I think we can resolve the tension if we see the past-present connection not as one of linear development from some different past, gradually getting more and more like us in the present, but as a connection of perception from the present of the different past in a changing present day context. The process by which we visit this foreign country, just like a tourist, is impacted by what's on our minds right now. And what's on our minds right now changes as the world changes, as our place in the world changes as well. So the past might still be a very foreign place. I think it is, but we travel there from a changing present. And as we do that, our views of what's important in the past change. So with that rather abstract initial framing of the work of writing history, I want to now give some specific meaning to it, to put some flesh on the bones of this statement, to make it more granular. Perhaps self-indulgently, I'll do this by sharing thoughts on my own dialogue, I suppose, internal dialogue between a changing present and the past, as it's unfolded in writing, and then 3 times so far, revising a survey history of modern Japan over the past 30 years. Exactly 30 years ago, my colleague in the history department at Duke University, where I was at the time, William Chafe, an excellent historian of the United States, and at the time he was the department chair, he encouraged me to write a survey history or textbook, and in a moment I'll talk about that term, on modern Japanese history. He had done the same just before that for the history of the United States, and told me he found it a valuable experience in 2 ways. One, and that also turned out to be my experience. First, he had learned a lot in the process of the writing. He had learned himself. Second, he had reached a larger audience with the survey history, the textbook, than he had with his narrower books written for an academic audience. Although I should say that in Bill Chafe's case, even those books reached a quite considerable audience. So he introduced me to his editor at Oxford University Press, and I started to write. It took longer than I expected, and it was more difficult than I expected. I thought this is going to be easy. I've been teaching Japanese history in the classroom, the exact period I was going to cover in the book. At that time, it was around 1994, so I had been teaching in the classroom for about 15 years. And I thought, okay, I've got my lecture notes, I've got my story, the lecture notes are written down. It's easy, I'll just type them out in a slightly more formal way and I'll have a textbook. Well, that was naive. It wasn't so easy. I learned how sloppy my lectures were as soon as I started to look up some things and check some things. And it turned out to be quite a challenge, but a fun challenge. And it took about 8 years between agreeing to write the textbook and coming out with the first edition, which was in 2002. Now I want to step back with a couple words about words. The English word textbook, I do not think translates well into the Japanese word that is usually translated to and from textbook of kyokasho. The latter, the Japanese term, I believe, refers to books mainly used in pre-college education, especially middle school or high school, which are authorized by the government, although privately written. These books are short, generally. They're generally full of facts and, of course, some interpretation, but more laying out just the facts. They are generally not sold, or perhaps never sold, in ordinary bookstores, for they are not intended to be used by a general audience or to be read by a general audience. The English word textbook can include that sort of publication and have that sort of meaning. For instance, there is a textbook authorization system in the United States, which is the place I know best, at the state level, by which private publishers write textbooks. The state of, say, California and Texas, which are the two most important in this process because of their large population, those states' governments look at and authorize the textbooks for use, and then it's up to the public schools to use those texts. That's actually very similar to the Japanese story, although it unfolds at the state level. Because California and Texas are so big, the textbook publishers first want to get approved in those states because they have a lot of schools. And so those states, in a sense, set a national standard. But in any case, my point here is that textbook in English does, in some cases, carry the same meaning as kyokasho in Japanese, but not necessarily, especially when it comes to books that are used in colleges. These are often written with the idea, and this was true for me, that they might reach a general audience. And so they're sold in bookstores as well as made available to students. So Oxford University Press, when it approached me, said, we see two audiences for what you're going to write. The first audience primarily are students in college classes, but there also, we believe, will be an interested general public. So in the Japanese title of this talk, I have referred to my book, or I will refer to my book as a tsushi in Japanese, or which might translate back into English as survey history or general history rather than textbook. So here are the covers of the 4 editions thus far of my text. And you can see that they're relatively or quite evenly spaced every 6 years or so, starting in 2002. The most recent one published 6 years ago in 2019, right before the pandemic. I hope to write one final edition, the 5th, which would be a 5th edition, but I have not started it yet. I've started to talk about it with the publisher, and I think they'll want me to do it. It would come out at the earliest in 2027. And towards the very end today, I'll make some brief comments on what that revision might argue or focus on. But I'm going to primarily focus on the 3 revisions of the 1st to the 2nd, 2nd to the 3rd, and 3rd to the 4th edition. The 1st edition had a general stance that is well reflected in the English title, although not reflected at all in the Japanese language title. I should mention that I was surprised but delighted to see that there was interest in Japan for publishing and reading this book. Misuzu Shobo published it, as you can see, in 2006. The 1st edition came out with the title of 200 Years of Japanese History, or Nihon no 200 nen. And then a 2nd Japanese edition, which was actually a translation of the 3rd English edition, came out in 2013. And this title in Japanese does not convey the point that I was seeking to convey with the English language title, but I think it works as a title in the Japanese language. That point is this, that I think the title signals the importance of 2 themes, and I wrote this in the introduction: modernity and connectivity. I think a more typical title for a survey history of Japan, a textbook in English, a textbook on Japan with an English title would be Modern Japanese History, rather than A Modern History of Japan. which I purposely chose because I think it makes people stop and think a little bit, because it's not the intuitively chosen title. Modern Japanese history, as the title suggests, that the Japaneseness of the story is central, I believe. It points readers to a peculiarly Japanese story that happened to unfold in an era we call modern, because the word Japanese is at the heart of the title. Whereas the book I wrote, and with the purpose to make this point, I wrote my textbook with the goal of shifting the balance between Japaneseness and modernity, trying to tell instead of telling a peculiarly Japanese story that unfolded in an era we call modern, I tried to tell a peculiarly modern story that unfolded in a place we call Japan. And because of that, I think it also reaches out to try to connect to modern experiences globally. That's the connectivity part. So now, with that longish preface, let me turn to the three actual and then very briefly the fourth planned revision that I've undertaken in dialogue with a changing present. I should also say that the present in relation to these revisions has changed in two rather different ways. First, and this is the more intuitively obvious, I think, way, is that present day issues or present day events in Japanese politics or society emerge newly, or present day global events emerge newly over time to prominence. And as these present day issues or events occur or emerge, it leads me and others to take a different view of the past. And that's the case in two of the three revisions I'll talk about today, as well as the fourth planned revision. But there's another way in which a changing present can affect the way one writes history, and that is newly emerged themes or topics of historical studies come to prominence among historians. And as that happens, say in global history or in history of places including but outside Japan, it leads me or other historians of Japan to see the need to revise Japanese history to reflect these new concerns among historians. So that's a second sense of present day change that brings me and other historians into dialogue and revision of the past. So let me now turn to the first revision. I should say I made many small revisions in each new edition, but I'm talking today about what I see in each case as the most notable sort of conceptual revision. Moving from the first to the second edition, what had happened in between 2002 and 2008 was a reignition of the flame of territorial disputes between Japan and two neighbors, the People's Republic of China and the Republic of Korea, or South Korea. In 2003 to 2004, dispute between Japan and the PRC over who had sovereignty of, or should have sovereignty of, and control of the place that the Japanese called the Senkaku Islands, that the Chinese called Diaoyu Islands. Tensions rose significantly when the Japanese government took over the lease of the islands from a private owner. And Chinese protesters tried to, and in one case succeeded to, land on the islands, which were and still are under the administrative control of Japan. The image you see here on the right is a fanciful image created by a Chinese patriotic or nationalistic person, we can assume. The Chinese protesters who landed on the island never got to the apex of that hill or mountain, and certainly never planted a flag remotely of that size. So this is an imagined version of what people in China wanted to see happen. And also, in the same span of time between the first and second edition, heightened tensions emerged between South Korea and Japan over the place or the islands that the Japanese call Takeshima, that the South Koreans call Dokdo, and that in Anglophone writing historically has been called the Liancourt Rocks. They don't even, the English term doesn't even give it the dignity of being considered an island, just a bunch of rocks. And it's true that nobody lives there. At times in the past, people have lived on the Senkaku Islands in very tiny populations for industrial work. So as I turned to revise the first edition, I realized, okay, this is new stuff. And I didn't mention anything about these. Well, it's new stuff in the sense that it's a newly emerged controversy. It's certainly not an issue that people did not know about. The diplomats knew about it. Professor IOKIBE certainly knew about it. Historians had written about this island dispute. International relations scholars had written about it, but it didn't have a high prominence. I think that high of a prominence in the general public or even in the mind of most historians. And it was never, these islands and these disputes I never mentioned once in the first edition. I said, okay, this is a problem. I need to talk about it. But I quickly realized, and this is the case with all the revisions, it's not enough, or I didn't feel it would be enough to just insert a discussion in the last chapter of, okay, folks, okay, dear reader, there's a problem now that Japan and China, Japan and Korea are arguing over this sovereignty issue. Because, of course, there was a history to this argument. So then it becomes necessary to recast the presence and the reemergence of these island disputes as part of a longer-term history of expanding and contracting borders of Japan, starting at least, I think, with the 1860s. And if you look at the second edition, you'll find what I added, perhaps not sufficient, but anyway, on around pages 75 and 76. So I felt I needed to go back and insert into that earlier chapter some discussion in order to have it make sense that this dispute would reemerge in the 21st century. I didn't, and I don't see my role as judging the validity of either the Japanese or the legitimacy of either the Japanese or the Chinese or the Korean claims in the present. But I did ask a colleague who must remain anonymous because he was working at the time for the United States government Office of the Historian, which I hope will survive the current complicated moment in attacks on American government institutions. In any case, he had been asked in these years in the early 21st century to look into the history of this issue because the American government was concerned about its own stance. And he found, this person knew the Chinese language, unlike me. He found Chinese gazetteers of the 1850s and 1870s, which described Jiaoyu as lying, and this is this person's translation of the Chinese, beyond Taiwan in the seas to the north, which suggests that at least the authors of those gazetteers saw these islands as sort of beyond the realm of what might have been considered China, or at least one could use these gazetteers to argue that side. But I decided my job wasn't really to sit in judgment, but rather to try to recast the story of the Meiji era, not simply as Japan emerging into a status as an empire by the late years of the Meiji era, but also as a many decades long process, beginning even in the 1860s and 70s, by which a new Japanese state sought to, and this is how I put it in the text, draw borders and incorporate territories at the vaguely defined margins of new nations and old empires. The old empire, the Qing Empire, the Russian Empire. I'm not talking right now about the Northern Island issue or the Northern Territories issue, but this is also part of the story. And newly emergent nations, such as Japan, or in the early 21st century, the Republic of China. So that is to say, there's a complicated process of the drawing of borders and the incorporating of territories in the margins that needs to be brought to the center of history. I think that's what that type of reinterpretation was precipitated in my own thinking by the present day process, and it led me to go back with new eyes to the past. So let me now, and I should say it's still an ongoing issue, both of these issues, plus the Northern Islands. Let me turn now to the second revision story, which was prompted by something that happened just as I was beginning to work on the third edition, and that was the March 11th, 2011 Great East Japan earthquake or disaster, which demanded both in-depth discussion itself, of course, but also a historical context. And when the disaster happened, and then about a year later, I turned to the textbook revision, I realized, and I was extraordinarily embarrassed to discover that my previous two editions were egregiously weak in any discussion of Japan's vulnerability to disasters, whether from volcanoes or from earthquakes or tsunami or typhoon. Or conversely, the previous editions were weak, which is to say they said nothing about the accumulated experience of responding to disasters. Well, not quite nothing. I did have a discussion of the great Kanto earthquake, the horrendous Kanto earthquake of 1923, but that was it. No other discussion of any disasters in the previous versions of my textbook. I think, though, this is not just something that was my mistake, it was, or my overlooking of something important. I think it reflects the fact that in the mainstream of the writing of Japanese modern history, disasters have not been well incorporated, had not been well incorporated. So I thought, okay, of course I'm going to add a lengthy discussion in the final chapter of this new edition of the 2011 earthquake, but I also need to go back and do something about prior disasters, of which, as soon as you start to think about it, there are many. And as I said, I felt this had not been well done by historians for the most part, as opposed to studies of people who study disasters. Of course, they write about disasters. But then this was the challenge I faced. And I don't think I've fully and adequately addressed it, but the challenge is how to do more than just add a list of disasters in respective chapters. From Edo era fires, I could mention a few of that, or I could mention Edo period earthquakes, the awful Nobi Plain earthquake in Meiji, Japan in 1891, the Sanriku earthquake later in the 1890s, again in the 1930s, and tsunami, the Kanto Daishinsai, which I had mentioned, post-war typhoons. How to do more than just list them in each chapter to sort of create some context. I mean, that's one thing that needs to be done, but I wanted to bring some interpretive point or points to this integration of the history of disaster with the wider history of Japan. And what I've hit on are two strategies. I think there are others that one could bring to bear. One is to make the point that disasters shape culture and politics, both at the moment that they happen and ongoingly. And the second, which I'll get to in a moment, is that disasters are not really ever only or mainly natural events, but they're also primarily even social events. So as an example of the way disasters shape culture and politics, I added a brief discussion. I didn't use this image, which is very powerful, of an earthquake that hit the city of Edo, today Tokyo, as you know, in 1855, which was the Ansei era in the Japanese counting of time. The Ansei earthquake not only destroyed homes and caused fires, as you can see in this Kawaraban or broadsheet from 1855, it also destroyed the newly constructed shore batteries that had been set up to protect Edo from a potential return of the barbarians. Because, of course, in 1855, it's just a couple years after Commodore Perry He hadn't sailed all the way. He had landed outside of Tokyo, of Edo, but in any case, the Bakufu was worried, so they had invested time and money into putting these shore batteries, and the earthquake destroyed them. So this was seen at the time. It had a political impact in leading people to think that there's a kind of heavenly punishment that shows that the Tokugawa are losing legitimacy. And I think it would be a vast exaggeration to say that the Tokugawa regime fell because of the political disgrace of the earthquake destroying the batteries, but it's just part of a process of declining legitimacy of the Tokugawa order. I also realized in preparing this talk that I should have brought into the last chapter a discussion of a statement by the then, I think he was the governor of Tokyo at the time, Ushioda, saying that he thought that the March 11th disaster was a heavenly punishment for Japan. So this idea actually had a longer life. But so this is one way in which I thought we need to bring in to the history of Japan the notion of disasters as shaping politics and culture. A second way, and I had a brief discussion of this, is looking at the Nobi Plain earthquake of 1891. The Nobi Plain is in the vicinity of Nagoya. And it was a devastating earthquake. One of the surprising outcomes was that some Japanese traditional structures, such as pagodas, five-story pagodas, proved more resilient than new Western buildings that people had understood, and certainly Westerners had understood, as more resilient and advanced than Japanese architecture. And this illustration, depending on the size of the screen on which you're viewing today, might be a little hard to see, but in the lower row of 4 illustrations, the second one from the right is an iron bridge across a river which collapsed, and that's modern architecture. So the Nobi Plain earthquake had a cultural or political impact in that it generated a new appreciation for and a kind of pride in Japanese traditional architecture as disaster resilience. It also had a political and scientific or intellectual impact in making seismology a field of great importance in Japan and high excellence ever since. So that's one way in which I think, one way in which I was led to not only make a list of disasters, but talk about disasters as integrated in the interpretation of modern Japanese history. The second way is to make the point that disasters are really not mainly social or, disasters are never really entirely or even mainly natural events, but they're always social and human events. And one can argue on the extent of this, but for instance, imagine an uninhabited island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, over which a tsunami sweeps in the wake of an earthquake, and all the vegetation and all the trees are destroyed, or maybe all the animals are killed. Though that would not be treated by historians as a disaster in the same way that a disaster would be treated when there's not only impact on humans, that's obvious, but humans, in a sense, created the situation in which the impact was powerful or bad. And an important example of this is the over-reliance over time on hydraulic engineering or coastal engineering seen in the erection of ever greater seawalls. And the one in this image is the seawall in the district Taro in the town or city of Miyako along the Iwate coast. And I believe it's either the largest or one of the very largest seawalls in Japan, or was at the time in 2011. It had proven its value in the case of some previous less massive tsunami caused by earthquakes. And it led to some degree of complacence it seems, on the part of the people living to the right-hand side, on the inside of the seawall, because they were fine in the past, they would be fine now. So to the extent that people did not run for high ground as quickly or as unanimously as they might have, this disaster had a social aspect. And this isn't just a story of 2011, but it's a story of the engineering of the Japanese coast over the many decades prior. The other, even more obvious example of the ways in which a disaster, in this case, the March 11th disaster, was not simply natural, of course, is the story of the meltdown of the Fukushima Daiichi, or the F1 nuclear reactor, because it was a series of decisions over decades from the 1960s, so about a nearly 50-year history of policy decision-making that led to the generators and the backup power to be located low, to the seawall to be below the level at which even some had predicted there might actually be a tsunami. And so certainly this disaster also had a policy or a social or human cause as much or even more than a natural cause. So these are two ways I think that the story of disaster can be, needs to be, and I think there's more that I and others can do in this regard to be woven into the wider history of Japan's modern times. One, to talk about cultural and political impact, another to highlight the ways in which disasters have social and political, not only results, but causes. Let me now turn to the third revision that I made between the third and fourth editions of the textbook. And this one is a little bit different. As I said at the outset, there are two ways in which a changing present might impact how historians treat the past. In this case, it was a change in the current day practice of writing history, more than a new current event, that drove my revision. And that is the emergence of the history of the environment as a major focus among historians globally of many places in the world. Although it's also the fact, is also true that my desire to bring this new historical trend into the Japanese historical story reflected a present-day global event, if you will, or process, which is climate change or climate crisis, and the emerging consensus that we lived and still live in a new epoch that's been called the Anthropocene. So I felt a need to integrate the environmental history of modern Japan and early modern or Tokugawa Japan into a general history. Unlike the drawing of borders, which was the focus of my first revision and rethinking, or the bringing of disasters into the story, the environment had not been entirely absent in my prior editions. And I think the story of the post-war Japanese environment in particular has been written about to a fair extent by historians, especially when it comes to pollution that accompanied high-speed economic growth. And I did write, and in the earlier editions, in some detail about the post-war pollution cases. But other than that, there was very little in my text to reflect a wider understanding of the history of the environment or the history of human-environment interactions. It also was a much more complicated task than the prior two revisions, partly because it required me to learn some more stuff, and also because there were so many potential topics. I mean, there were lots of disasters that I could have talked about, but I think there were even in the prior revision, but there were even more potential topics. So I was greatly aided by research assistants who were graduate students at the time at Harvard, who were working in environmental history with my colleague Ian Miller. So I was able to turn to them for advice. And so I want to acknowledge John Hayashi and Reed Knapp, who gave me a lot of help in this process. So what did I do? Or what were the reinterpretations or the new ways of thinking that I tried to bring into the story with a new awareness that the environment was an important part of history. I think there were four main things that I tried to do. And actually, in preparing this talk, it's made me a little more self-aware of exactly what I was trying to do at the time. One, and probably the most sustained, because I touch on it in a number of places in the fourth edition, is to focus on energy, to focus on what you might call ancient biomass, although biomass is not usually understood to include fossilized fossil fuel or fossils, but coal, also forests, also whales. And the way that I like to put it is, it's the process and project of unlocking energy from the environment that is at the heart and needs to be seen at the heart of the more general modern history of the world, including certainly Japan. And so I tried to do that, bring this focus on energy in particular, but not only coal, into the revision. And the centrality of coal to the Meiji era economy through the 1950s, once you start looking at it, is obvious. And I had not given that enough attention previously. There have been historians who've brought the story of coal and coal mining into the heart of modern Japanese history before, so this isn't a brand new thing, but I saw a need to make it a central theme, the unlocking of energy from the environment. On the right-hand side is a photograph I took of one of the coal pits of the now closed down Mitsui Miike mine, the Manda pit. It's now a World Heritage Site, and I'm working on it for my own current research. So I visited and took this photograph, and you can see the guide pointing the elevator out to me. So one topic was the unlocking of energy from the environment with a particular focus on coal. A second topic was related, but it's the link between technology and resources and the exhaustion of resources. Especially in the Edo era, I believe what happened was the limits of technology didn't exhaust resources completely, but exhausted the ability of people at the time to exploit natural resources. And so it awaited new technologies that came in the second half of the 19th century to reopen the exploitation of some resources. And here, I'm thinking in particular of both forests, which is a slightly different story, and then silver, gold, and copper. Japan's silver mines were largely exhausted, at least with the available technologies, by about 1800. And here on the right-hand side, you have a picture of the Iwami silver mine in southwestern Honshu, which is also, like Miike, a World Heritage Site. Copper, too, given the technologies available, was largely exhausted, or the ability to extract copper had reached a limit by the 19th century. The resource itself was not exhausted. And so when new technology comes available in the 1870s, 80s, 90s, copper mining restarts hugely. The story with forestry is a little different because old growth forests were largely wiped out or cut down in the Tokugawa period with the development of cities that drew on wood for construction or for fuel. But a very robust process of reforestation also developed. And so the ability to regenerate forests was important. And in that sense, forests is a little different story than these other metal resources because there was a process to regenerate. However, this process relied on monoculture, and I'll come back to this point in a moment or two, in particular, the sugi, or the tree. So energy, unlocking energy from the environment, the issue of resource exhaustion, and then new technologies and new exploitation of resources. And then related to that, of course, the story of environmental degradation and efforts at remediation, not only during the high-growth post-war era, but starting in the 1890s. And the most famous case there is the Ushioda copper mine refinery, with the Furukawa company's ability to bring new technology in, especially from Germany, to both mine copper and to refine it. There was both tremendous profit to be made, but also tremendous damage to be inflicted on the environment. This arrow points both to the location where the Ushioda copper mine and refinery was, and also to a village that was devastated by the sulfuric acid from the refinery smokestacks. I should say that down in the lower part of the this photograph, aerial photograph, is the Watarase River Valley that was also damaged tremendously by the refinery waste. But talking just about upstream, this is what the mountains around Ushio looked like by the early 20th century. And later, reforestation has been going on and some progress has been made, but the story of environmental degradation and attempts at remediation needs to be part of modern Japan's history for sure. So energy, unlocking energy from the environment, new technologies that can overcome limits in resource extraction, environmental degradation and remediation. Finally, the fourth point that I tried to weave into the general story of Japan's modern history is unintended consequences of environmental policy. And I think one of the best examples of this, and it's an example that many of you in the audience today, if you happen to be in Japan, are going to be afflicted with, starting around now as the temperature warms up and as the pollen count rises, is the fact that Japan becoming a nation of allergic people is not a genetic thing. It's not an ancient cultural thing. It's a product and an unintended consequence of what had been seen to be a wise environmental policy of reforestation. The trend towards monoculture in reforestation was already underway even in the Tokugawa period. It further deepens in part at the urging of American forestry experts after World War II, and also for commercial reasons, because the suki and the hinoki grew fast and they had commercial value. But it leads to a verdant, beautiful Japanese countryside, including mountain landscapes, such as in the photograph here that you see, the sugi plantation in Akita Prefecture, which has created a beautiful green landscape of pollen production. So Japan, having become an allergy nation, is an unintended consequence of a long string of environmental policies. Finally, to come back to the question of extracting energy from the environment, whether it's ancient biomass or ancient fossil fuel, or whether it's biomass. It struck me as I was rethinking Japan's history with attention to the environment, that the two most important interactions of the United States and Japan both came down to environmental history and the extraction of resource of energy from the environment. First, whaling. This is a slightly anachronistic illustration on the left because it's titled Boats Attacking Whales. It looks to me like the whales are attacking the boats, but this was an illustration done by a British writer a little bit before Perry's arrival in Japan. But Commodore Perry comes to the United States not only seeking trade in the general way, but seeking support for American whaling ships that might call on Japanese ports. And then, of course, nearly a century later, a different type of energy resource, which is to say petroleum oil, wasn't at the heart of the Japanese economy overall by 1930s and 40s, but it was increasingly important to the Japanese Navy. So oil, which was in abundance in Indonesia. This is a more recent map, but it shows where some of the most important Indonesian oil fields are. At the time, it was the Dutch colony. So at two key moments in US-Japan relations, exploitation of energy from the environment played a key role. Finally, and I want to end here and offer time for Professor IOKIBE's comments and some discussion. I don't have time to give the details, and I haven't figured out the details because I haven't started doing this yet. But the pandemic, like March 11th, 2011, was a sudden event that has forced, at least in my mind, a rethinking of a broader historical narrative. There was very little even in the most recent edition of my textbook, there's very little on history of public health. I mentioned tuberculosis very briefly. I mentioned smallpox very briefly. I mentioned the tainted blood scandal more recently connected to HIV. Mm-hmm. I don't mention, and I checked all my competitor textbooks the other day in English, none of us mentioned the Spanish flu. None of us mentioned the Spanish flu, which killed more people, I believe, than all of the modern wars in Japan up until that point. So there's a pressing need to integrate a history of disease and public health into modern history generally and Japanese history. And I think, and this is where I'll end, a core point of this project as I undertake it will be to recognize that disease and thus public health is particularly resistant to borders and particularly impossible to narrate in a bordered national frame. It makes it, of course, a little hard to talk about in a text that's supposed to be focused on Japan. But it's a powerful topic for reinforcing the points about how it's the modernity of Japanese history and the global connectivity of Japanese history that needs to be at the core. So I'll stop there and thank you all and look forward to IOKIBE Sensei's comments.
Okay, please.
Okay, thank you very much for having me, and this is my great honor. Professor Gordon is a person of faith and a scholar of integrity, and I heard his talk 20 inches away. So this is my great privilege. And well, and each car will certainly take credit on you for his remark that history is a dialogue between the past and present. Your talk is a beautiful example how a historian develops his or her understanding on the past as the present situation plays out. And so my family is jealous of me for monopolizing you with Professor Naoko SHIMAZU and a couple of kind staffers from Tokyo College, and my graduate students are mad at me. So I try to be brief, and so that we can have more discussions and feedback. So basically, I try to limit my comments in two folds, and one is to be more inherent to your project. Tell us more about how to write textbook, not kyokasho. And the second comment from me is, well, out of my overwhelming curiosity about your 5th edition, how you treat the issue of democratization in regard of the present difficult situation globally. The challenges that democracies are facing today. So to start from my first comment, you made an interesting point about the difference between textbook and kyokasho. And I'm also aware that recently in Japanese academia, there are increasing project of writing textbook instead of kyokasho, because as you said, it's an opportunity to reach a larger amount of readers. And but still, I think the difference influences. I mean, there's still an heritage of kyokasho within the projects of writing textbooks. The Japanese version of textbooks are usually very short, like kyokasho, and they are asked to write shorter and while including a lot of facts and data. And of course, there's a room for interpretation, maybe larger room than the case of kyokasho. But because, for example, this is my favorite books, your Japanese translation of your third edition of your textbook. And if you try to do that for Yu Hikaku alone, you would have a tenacious negotiation with the editor because it's too long for them. And in light of the Japanese ideas of textbooks, there are some long textbooks, but I think they don't sell as much as they should. So certainly a kind of cultural heritage in regard of reading and writing textbooks. And then they tend to have less interplay among different sectors of society, like politics, economy, and environment, etc. And also, there's a kind of indulgence that as they have to be compact, they are allowed to be less informative or less insightful, if I may say. And compared with that, with this length of textbook, your knowledge or insight are always challenged in depth, in length. So, which makes me curious, and of course, even a historian like you, in some topics you have more knowledge than other topics, like so I'm interested in the relation between the your textbook and your more specific research preceding this project. Like you are well known for your works on labor relations and later home appliance like machines, and how that influences the way you write your textbook. Your argument or theory on transfer period is a comprehensive understanding of the era, but no doubt your understanding on the political economic relations plays a vital role. So certainly I see that your accumulation of knowledge on your preceding works plays a role. So that's a point I'm interested in. And also I hope the audience is interested, because the ambitious audience, they are thinking about their specific researches, but in the future they would like something like you've done. So they would like to write a textbook and have a chance to revise it from time to time. So that's why I throw out this question. Now, my second question is about democracy, and so I don't need to rehearse what's going on, but democracy is now in a difficult situation. And decades ago, probably the notion that the United States and European countries are leading figures in light of democracies, and I still think so in some regards. I mean, the populism is accompanied by a kind of developed or mature democracy, and that's why that's tenacious, and that's why this is not easy to handle. But still, there's no easy way of understanding that as as the time goes by, countries will be more westernized and more democratized. And also, if you look at the countries that people recently call Global South, there are plenty of countries that are not democratic, but somehow well governed compared with leading figures in the West. But in the meantime, there's still a strong aspiration for democracy all over the world. So it's really a complicated situation. And to incorporate is not the job of the historian, probably. But I'm curious how you treat this issue in your 5th edition. Recently, one of my projects is to make the experience of Japan as a kind of a catalog of possible undemocratic regimes. And so if you take an era from 1885 up to the beginning of the First World War, and if you make a list of cabinets that emerged one after another, in most cases that's an transition between a purely clan clique government, Hanbatsu government, or other cliques, bureaucracy or military, on the one hand, and then a cabinet that allows political parties to join, to occupy a seat of a significant member of the cabinet, or sometimes even the prime minister, really one after the other, and it looks like this is not a good regime in terms of democracy, and personally I don't really like it, but that might be one solution, that the clique government performs a good governance in regard of administration. And the other government, with the participation of political parties, made a certain achievement of accountability. Listen to that, or represent a certain portion of the population. It might look like a gradual democratization, but it also may look like an effort to keep people from being disillusioned with the party politics. That was still, which is still immature. Then we have the second period. We have an interval period, and there's an 80 years of party cabinets, and looks more democratic, but two major parties took powers one after the other, but they failed to control the political strife between themselves, and then which ended up in the militarism. And then the third period is LDP, one-party dominance of the Liberal Democratic Party, and in regard of the political competitiveness or the political corruption and poke and barrel, it's very problematic, but many countries are envious. And now the fourth period is today, and after the political reform through the 1990s, there's an harbinger of more competitive party politics, but I think Japan somehow mistook Seiji Shudo, confused Seiji Shudo, political leadership with Kanpei Shudo, leadership of the Prime Minister office, and so which is understandable because bureaucracy has been playing a huge role, sometimes more important than the party politicians. So it's vital to control the bureaucracy, the ministries. But the Prime Minister office tend to exert a strong leverage on each ministry, and people start doubting the accuracy or credibility of the data dispatched by the government, and also the neutrality of the bureaucracy, and that undermines the credibility of the opposition party's policy because they seem to have less support and information from the bureaucracy, and think tanks and civil society still need to develop. And also the credibility of the government's policy as well, because the data to prove the validity of the policy is now in question. And if you look at those 4 areas, you can like and dislike one or another, but like the maybe Thailand conservative leader in a few years ago may find the first period very promising or quite similar to the politics in Thailand. It's an change of government between military and the civilian, and the civilian government was not always highly appreciated. And I talked about the kind of a high reputation of the LDP dominance, one-party dominance politics already. And as we put them through the history, we can somehow, recognize the reason of those regimes, but also as time goes by, that regime have to change. So we can somehow persuade today's self-confident leaders in autocratic governments that they have to think about the further democratization in the future. Well, I talked too much about my own project, but so maybe I'm not asking, how you redefine the democracy, but the way democracy plays a role or appears in the history, how you think about in your next edition is my question. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks. So let me try to briefly respond to your comments, because I do see some questions from the audience that we should have a chance to address. The first question about length and about sort of trade-offs and the balance between what I know a lot about and what needs to be in a textbook. It's true that what I wrote is longer than most Japanese kyokasho or tsushi, or including those that are published for a general audience. Even so, I felt limited by Oxford University Press's notion of how long is long enough and how long is too long. And especially with each new edition, I took out very little. I tried to condense the writing a little bit, and I added stuff. And so inevitably there are limits and there are trade-offs, and I tried my best to be balanced. Inevitably, I tilted towards the things I already knew about and cared about. If you look at the textbook, it's a little bit weak, for instance, on intellectual history. There's some discussion of intellectual trends, but that's not the heart of my own historical work. I received some comments after the first edition that there's not enough discussion of religion, and I brought in a little bit more. But inevitably, I talk about what I know about, even though I realize the form of a survey history has to be wide. It has to be wide-ranging. It's more fun to write about the stuff that I research, because that's what I really care about. But it's a story of trade-offs. I feel writing a textbook or a survey history is more like writing a sonnet than a novel. You have there's a form, there's a fixed form, and you have to sort of fit your argument into the fixed form. It's not as fixed as a sonnet, of course, but so that's on your second question. So that's a brief comment on your first question. On your second question of democratization, you know, I have a list that if I had time, I would have shown of the topics I want to treat when I start talking about public health in a revised edition. But in addition to topics, I want to have a kind of conceptualization or reconceptualization, and your comment is helpful because I think democracy and wise public health policy, just like other aspects of wise policy, don't always sit together neatly. And in the Japanese case, for instance, smallpox vaccines were resisted by the population. And actually, globally, this is true. In Brazil, there were riots against smallpox vaccines being imposed. And so there's a question of trust between authority and science and ordinary people. And to the extent that a country is less democratic, it might be possible for the experts to impose their will. And this was most prominent in the Japanese case right after World War II in the public health field, when the most stringent vaccine requirement in the world was adopted by Japan under the regime of the American, well, the Allied, but mainly American occupiers, and a man named Crawford Sams. To not get vaccinated was not only against the law, but there was a very heavy fine imposed on people. And so that was not democratic. It had a powerfully positive impact on public health, but it also produced a backlash and a reaction. So your comment helps me think through how I'm going to thematically treat this topic and these trade-offs between promotion of and a view of democracy as desirable and a promotion in view of good governance is desirable. And this is not just limited to public health. It's a global challenge. As you note, it's been a challenge in Japanese history. Arguably, the military and bureaucratic dominated cabinets in the late 19th and early 20th century had a more cautious view of using military force overseas than later. That's a well-known point in Japanese history, although it was eventually a military dominated political system that went into the Second World War. So yes, that question of democracy is critical in thinking about the history of disease and public health and vaccination. So I am going to try to bring that out.
Thank you very much.
I don't know if you're interested in commenting or are you happy to? I just wondered whether you wanted the floor to respond to the comments made by Professor Gordon, or if not, we just go into discussions.
It's up to.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I actually would like to say something.
Please.
Because I've been a great fan of your textbook. And, you know, when I was both in UK and Singapore, I used your book.
Thank you.
And the reason why I liked it so much is because there's so much, it's sort of so driven by socioeconomic concerns, societal concerns. And you managed to give the kind of, the sort of, let's say, a more bottom-up kind of history than most of these so-called textbooks do. And so this is why my students love them, because of that, actually. Because there are so many other textbooks that, you know, that cover primarily political, or, you know, well, yeah, political would be a very strong, it used to be like that, as we know, decades ago. But I think yours was one of the earliest to bring society in its totality into the discussion of Japanese history. But today, I just can't tell you how impressed I am with the way you engage with your revisions. Like, it's like I now know I can never write a history of anything like you do, because it's incredible, Andy. Can I just congratulate, because I'm just so impressed that every time you did the revision, which, okay, it could have been just, you know, coincidence that you were asked to do it 5 or 6 years later. yeah, you picked up one of the key turning points in historiography, right? Because the first edition, right, that you did in 2008, you kind of really realized that borderlands were the important kind of thing that you didn't manage to think about as much before. But that was a critical turning point in historiography as well as in research on thinking about the peripheral areas, borderlands, just generally speaking in history. So you kind of incorporated that as one of your key revision sort of themes, you know. And then you go on to the, to 2013, the great environmental turn. I mean, yes, of course, in Japan, the Great East Japan earthquake happened, but it was also like almost like the height of the environmental turn that was really gaining traction in historiography, generally speaking, in the Anglophone world at least. And so you picked on that. And you managed to kind of turn that into also integrated as one of the sort of motives for explaining Japanese history. And then the current idea that you have about pandemics, here, it's another thing that we've actually had to think about because of COVID-19, you know. So I'm just like, really, really impressed by this because it really shows to me the seriousness of engagement with the present that you have. So you talk about the past and the present. It's about this kind of negotiation that you have about particular kind of point in history time that you're revising your textbook. But I think it's actually really much more paradigmic than you think, in the sense that I think you're picking up the key trends in historiographical terms. And I just I'm really grateful that you're writing this kind of textbook, because I think it's I think I'm going to read your textbook with a completely different eye again, you know, because it would be so interesting now that I know to kind of see how that turn influenced the way that you revised it. Don't be like combing through. No, I'm just joking. But it's really difficult to do this. That's the thing. And textbooks are so difficult to write anyway, because you somehow have to make this kind of somehow beautifully coherent thing, which everybody's going to be more or less satisfied with. Of course, we can't satisfy everybody all the time, but it's got to kind of have that internal logic and coherence. So it's a very difficult task to do. You do that with aplomb, you know, not just write it, but you have this very thought-provoking turns with each of the revisions. So, so this is, I kind of really understood today why it's so good.
Let me just say one thing, that I hope you don't go through too carefully, because it's possible that in preparing this talk, I exaggerated how fully I did in the revision what I today said I did. And I did try to do all the things in the revision at each stage that I said today. But actually, especially the first one about the borders, as I was looking back over the text and thinking it through and realizing I was putting forth a much more coherent view today of my revision logic and process that sort of unfolded a little bit by trial and error. It's not that I made things up today, but I might have overplayed it a little bit. And so actually the 5th edition revision will also include going back over this talk and seeing if I can do better on each of the previous. But thanks for that comment.
No, but this is the point, that when you have time, it's like you have that sort of slight longitudinal kind of study of your own interpretations of how you wanted to write the history of modern Japan. And I think that is in itself, I mean, you realize probably today much more strongly than you did.
That's right, exactly.
2002, right? But this is the incredibly interesting part of learning about one's process in research, because I think it reflects things in, as you know, it's almost like an afterthought, but it isn't, because it helps you to kind of, you know, how do you call it? Sort of put it into kind of intelligible structure, how you must have done it. Because you know that realization that you often have after you've done your work some years ago or some decades ago.
Oh yeah, this is what it was all about.
Yeah. So, okay, so let's go to the questions because we do have quite a lot of interesting questions. And so the first one is actually about your positionality in writing this, a textbook on modern Japan, because what this person says is, how did the global context outside of Japan's unique history impact or shift your way of perceiving the history of Japan? So that's, where are you on this question? And then there is actually a very interesting kind of like matching question on the other side, which is actually the third question that I'm going to go to, which is about, Japanese scholars writing about
This is the one that's in the Japanese language?
Yeah, their own, because I thought it's a nice question on positionality. Where are you when you're writing the history of a country? It could be your country, it could be somebody else's country. But so what, what makes it different, I guess, if you are writing about your own country and you have to rethink every time you're revising or writing something. And I think this question is actually to do about, what are the kind of pitfalls? What are the points that you need to be aware of when you write a history of your own country? So perhaps it is sort of like a nice kind of balancing act between Andy Gordon and Yokio Kaoru about writing history from the outside and from the inside.
Right. I mean, these are interesting questions. They're not so easy to answer. And I mean, certainly my whole life engaged with Japan from the time I was a student to then undergraduate to graduate student to then professional historian. I'm always in a position as somewhat of an outsider. I say somewhat because I spend a lot of time in Japan and know and work with Japanese historians. This might be a naive thing to say, and Kaoru might disagree with it, but my impression is that the gap between, at least among academic professional historians, the gap between how non-Japanese and Japanese historians approach Japanese history was much wider long ago. And through generations of interactions and participating together in conferences, whether it's in other countries or in Japan, that to some extent, a shared consciousness has emerged. Or another way to put it is the divides and the controversies don't necessarily set historians in Japan of Japan against outside historians. If I think back to diplomatic history, there was a book that Kaoru, I'm sure you're familiar with, called, I think it was Borg and Okamoto, Pearl Harbor as History. It had a whole bunch of essays. And the American historians and the Japanese historians were very different. Or the American historian, there were probably others than Americans, but the Anglophone historians tended to be very critical of the United States or the British in the steps they took that created a situation that led to Pearl Harbor. And the Japanese historians tended to be extremely critical of their own government, of their navy, of their army, of their political system. And so there was an odd difference. Whereas I think today, if you were to revisit that, you would find that there are people in both positions, that is the outside of Japan position and the inside of Japan position, who are on both sides of that issue. And that there's certainly dissension and contention around how to understand the war on the road to war, but I don't think it divides so much into the positionality of being in Japan and outside Japan. There's issues of ideology and politics and history that cut across. So in that sense, I,
Mm.
I do think that not so much in my textbook, but to looking at the question, the question seems to have
Yes,
disappeared.
the first one, yes. it
Oh, that's
disappeared.
because it's considered
Yeah, yeah.
kaitozumi. Okay. The question about positionality outside of Japan, that yeah, I don't I think when I came to my labor history work, this positionality question was more, I had a sense of being in a different place because I was outside the Japanese intellectual world. That the Japanese historians of labor and management relations at the time were writing from a perception that was primarily Marxist of expecting the labor unions and labor movement and the proletariat more specifically to be in the vanguard of a transformation of society towards a socialist society. And actually, I was personally influenced by Marx and I was sympathetic to that, but I didn't see that as the story that had actually happened.
Mm.
And so I felt that I was approaching the study of Japanese labor history not from a position of what went wrong? Why did our labor movement fail?
Mm.
So the Japanese historians at the time, this is a kind of blunt generalization, were writing labor history in the 1950s and 60s and 70s from the perspective of what went wrong or what was structurally wrong with our society such that we never had a proper political transformation that would have been led from below or with the vanguard party and connected to below. And for me, it was, how did this powerful economic force that's called the Japanese economy or Japanese employment system come to exist? And within that, seeking agency, so among the workers, and saying that the laborers actually made a contribution. And I remember some conversation with Japanese historians who felt that I was approaching it the wrong way. So I think my positionality there was quite significant, and I don't feel it as much now, although that just might be a lack of my own self-perception of or self-awareness. And then as far as I don't really feel in a position to say what should Japanese historians of their own country have in mind when they rethink their history. That I don't like the position of preacher, so I'm going to step back from answering that. また日本人が自国の歴史を再興していくにあたり気をつけるべきことは何だと思いますか? I think IOKIBE sensei needs to answer that question.
So we're going to ask IOKIBE sensei, sorry, we only got 1 minute. So.
この質問.
Well, that's too difficult for me. But so as for the positionality, I agree with Andy and Gordon, Professor Gordon. And there's another gap. It's about the weight of discipline. So in Japan, every year we have an emerging star, rising star in the field of the political and diplomatic history, while probably not that many in Japan studies in the US or in other countries. So maybe so that makes an international dialogue more important and productive. As for Japanese history and looking at Japan is, I try not to hurry to make comparison. I go too deep into Japan history. And then if I get very deep, I sometimes find a universal implication that may be worth dispatching to English-speaking community. That's what I'm trying to do.
Well, unfortunately, all good things come to an end. And as much as I'd love to go on more, we have to wrap up today. So really like to thank Professor Gordon for the most stimulating insight into the process of revising your very successful textbook, and to Professor IOKIBE for offering your really interesting kind of counter view to what's been discussed today. So thank you very much to both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much
Okay,
for having me.
thank you.